This week we'll be discussing family planning services in India, how Congress once more passed our case, and lastly, we have some interesting news coming out of the White House that could directly impact and even lead to the creation of some debate cases that are already out there this year, or of course, make some new ones. We'll talk about all that. We're going to get to it and so much more. Stay tuned. This is the Team Policy Podcast. Okay, so Elijah, you have a quick public service announcement for us, but first, a quick word from our sponsor. We have a quick public service announcement to get to this week, but guys, just as a quick heads up, it's just me and Elijah this week. Stephen is currently out of town on a trip, so we wish him well. He'll be back soon. We've been really busy, but yeah, I mean, we have some stuff to cover for you guys, and we hope you enjoy it. But first, Elijah, what do you have to tell our audience?
So quick public service words. Quick public service announcement. We're going to do a little challenge, that includes you guys, our audience. So our challenge is for us to use a special word in at least one of our speeches in the upcoming tournament. Your job is to send us a word that we have to use at the next tournament. Whatever the selection is, each of us three will take one, and we'll have to use it. So if the word is supercalifragilistic expialidocious, then I have to fit that word into one of my speeches. Hopefully the outcomes will be really fun and entertaining. Of course, it can be literally any word, excluding cuss words, expletives, or stuff that you wouldn't say to your mom. And you can send it to us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or email. Email is teampolicypodcast@gmail.com. I'm not sure what the Instagram is. What's the Instagram?
It's just at Team Policy Podcast, same as our Facebook, which is just facebook.com/Team Policy Podcast. You can check us out on either one. Again, that Instagram is at Team Policy Podcast.
Okay, thanks. That's my announcement. I think, Christian, you're going to start in with our first topic for today.
Absolutely. So the thing you guys are all probably wondering about is whose case got passed and how and when and all that. So really quickly, just a disclaimer. It technically wasn't our whole case. Stephen and I were running a case that we wrote to do the Food for Peace Modernization Act. It's a popular plan on the East Coast, and I think a little bit out west, but more so on the East Coast. And we found out, unfortunately, I don't know how we didn't realize this sooner. I think we even had a brief saying this. We just completely forgot and just mentally zoned it out whenever we were writing this case. In 2018, Congress got rid of what was called monetization. Now, a little bit of background about FPMA and monetization. So first of all, FPMA did a few things. We talked about it a little bit on the show, not very much, but this is actually one thing you can use. I'm about to talk about in just a minute that you can use to beat this case. What FPMA does is an act from Congress that died in Congress in, I believe, 2018. I'd have to double check that off the top of my head. I think it died in 2018, around like March or something like that. And what the bill did was it got rid of the requirements that we have to monetize 15% of our food aid under the existing food aid programs from USAID. And it also changed up some of the sourcing requirements and said that up to 75% of the food that we provide to countries, whenever we give food aid, it can be bought locally, regionally, wherever really, doesn't really matter. That was beneficial in that it added flexibility and it got rid of just some costly regulations saying that we have to buy from the United States, even whenever it's more expensive. So all in all, it just made things more efficient, and the impact of the case was that supposedly you'd save 9 million lives, 40,000 of which are children each year. It was a pretty powerful case that had no real drawbacks other than just the drawbacks associated with foreign aid in general. So this is something you can use to beat the case, and that is that monetization, or the requirement to monetize 15% of our food aid, was actually abolished by Congress in 2018. In fact, I believe it was around March, around the time. I'm not sure the exact date, but around the general time frame in which the FPMA, or the Food for Peace Modernization Act, was put forth in Congress. So this is very interesting, and it's very helpful because it gets rid of what was really one of the main pillars of this case. The two main pillars, again, were the monetization requirement, getting rid of that, and changing the sourcing requirements so that 75% of food could be sourced outside the United States. It's unclear exactly how much of the efficiency gains would be due to one policy or the other. So arguably a team could still win with this case, even though one of their main pillars has already been done. But I would not at all recommend it. It's a huge inherency problem. Now, a lot of you may be wondering, if you don't know already, what is monetization? I've talked about this quite a bit in the past few minutes. But basically, monetization is this really wasteful practice where we take food in the United States, we buy it from U.S. farmers, we ship it thousands of miles around the world, and we sell it in local markets, and then use the money that we make from selling this food at dirt cheap prices in local markets halfway around the world to fund programs, development programs, maybe food programs, whatever it may be, in these countries locally. Now, this, aside from just how inefficient and horrible this sounds, like who thought this was a good idea, it's even worse than it sounds. In fact, estimates show that we waste somewhere between 30 and 50%, or basically cents, on every dollar spent on this program. So if we spend, say our Food for Peace program is, I don't know, $1 billion. I think it's definitely more than that. I don't know the numbers, again, off the top of my head. But let's just say it was $1 billion for a second. And let's say we monetize only 15% of that. So $1 billion, 15% of which is monetized. And of that, about 50% is totally wasted. I have a calculator right here. I wanna actually do the math.
75 million is wasted.
There we go, Elijah, the whiz in our group, doing the math ahead of me while I was typing into a calculator. I appreciate that. Yeah, so that's a lot of money wasted. Clearly, of what's not a huge percentage of the overall program. About half of that smaller percentage getting wasted. So basically 7.5% of the entire Food for Peace budget is getting wasted just off this one requirement, or at least it used to be, where we ship food, we buy it here, ship it thousands of miles around the world, do all this administering, and sell it at dirt cheap prices, and then use the funds to fund programs there. Instead, we could just give the money to them and get twice as much accomplished, basically. While numbers may vary, that's the rough synopsis of it. So that's what monetization is, or was. Really, it's not required anymore. But monetization now has, like I said, been not necessarily banned by Congress, but it's no longer required. So if it does work, if it does help, if it is beneficial in some instance, and it actually makes sense to do it, I don't know where that would ever be. Maybe you just had some food that you need to get rid of. USAID can still do it, but it's no longer required. And since it's no longer required, one of the pillars of our case is basically passed, so we're no longer inherent. And that's why we're changing cases. So that's the ultimate story here. If you're running FPMA, I urge you to change cases. If you're not running FPMA and you run against FPMA, look this up. Find the cards for it if you don't already have them. A lot of you probably already do have them. I don't know how we didn't think about this when running the case. Interestingly enough, my debate partner and I actually won our last tournament with this case. So it's something that I'm surprised more people aren't aware of, but it is taken care of by Congress. So Congress did something right. Anyway, that's the gist of monetization. And now moving on to another topic, Elijah's going to be talking about family planning.
Okay, the Indian family planning case. It's a really good case. So basically, we send money to India for family planning, and part of that money goes to sterilization camps. India has a big growth problem. There's like 1.3 billion people on that country. Um, so these women can get sterilized for basically for free. The problem is that the doctors in quote marks are incentivized, so they're like, as the affirmative team shows, um, like they're spending 4 minutes on every woman. And there's a lot of botched sterilizations. It's really bad. So basically, what the affirmative says is no more funding. Stop it. All done. No more. This case is kind of hard to argue against because, first of all, the affirmative wants to stop the U.S. from funding botched sterilization camps. Like, who wants to argue against that? And then, secondly, if you're going to go for the "this is bad, but affirmative will make it worse" tactic, which I would totally recommend. I think that's the only way you can, like, morally argue against the affirmative. You kind of have to advocate for other types of family planning, including abortion services. Depending on where you fall on that stance, that could be a problem for you. Although you don't go into specifics like that, you still have to talk about things that include that. Solvency, not in my opinion, not too much for the negative to argue. I mean, all we do is stop giving them money. That's it. Inherent, the case is actually not inherent because the Indian Supreme Court has already said most of their evidence is from 2016 about all these terrible acts that are being done in these sterilization camps. And the Indian Supreme Court took care of it. They said, we're going to arrest these quote mark doctors, and we're going to penalize them, and then we're going to pay back all the women who have suffered from these from an incorrectly done sterilization. And so, and then they halted all the camps. They said, nope, no more. Oop, you're done. So it's not really inherent. When we brought this up, the affirmative said I don't think they presented any evidence, but I might have been wrong. I might have just not heard it. I'll definitely give them the benefit of the doubt that the U.S. is actually still doing it behind their back, even though the Indian Supreme Court said to stop. And then topicality. Of course, topicality is kind of stupid and pointless because, I mean, you kind of just automatically get topicality this year. It's really broad. Anyway, there's two arguments I ran. It's not foreign aid because their current definition for foreign aid requires that it benefits the country, and they have said it's not helping India, therefore it's not benefiting. Therefore, the affirmative is not topical. And then it's not reform because their current definition says that reform has to improve the situation. And the affirmative is simply pulling away funding, not necessarily improving the situation. Like, maybe the camps could keep going on. Now, the AF did reply to this saying that only the U.S. is funding these camps, so therefore they would end immediately. I didn't hear that in their evidence, but, you know, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I guess you could use this as a solvency argument, that they're not solving for the situation because they're only pulling away funds, not, like, fixing it. But that's pretty much my rundown of this case. It's a really good case, I'll say. Christian, is there anything you want to add to it? I know that you and Steven went up against it a few times.
Well, we didn't actually go against it. We actually heard about it through the grapevine, but I will add a little bit. So just a little bit of background to this. I think you touched on it, but I want to make sure there's more depth provided just in case people might be hearing about this for the first time. So what the case is doing is it's saying that there's these cases of not just sterilization, but mass sterilization. So think a camp with, I don't know, so many thousand women lined up to be sterilized in one day with, I don't know how many doctors, but a camp usually poor sanitation, no running water, dirty, awful conditions, dirty utensils that aren't even getting cleaned between operations. And when we say botched operations, we don't mean like botched like they were injured or it had lots of bad side effects. We mean like botched like people are dying. And by people, I mean a lot of people. So this is a really ugly situation. What's been going on in India? Obviously, they have a huge population, so this is where they would. This is why they'd have to deal with things like this. But these camps, which the affirmative team will talk about, are very grotesque. And getting into just some of the actual policy aspects to it, so they will mandate that we want to get rid of all family planning funding to India entirely. Here's the problem with that. This is something my partner found. I don't know if I have the numbers available at the moment, but I am going to try to scroll through some miscellaneous things. So of the family planning aid we give to India, I think I encourage you all to look this up behind me. I think about 15% of the aid, a certain percentage of the aid actually goes to these sorts of sterilization operations, and the rest go to things like preventative measures, so birth control, condoms, things like that, that actually prevent people from needing to get sterilized in the first place. On the note of abortions and defending that, I actually disagree, because due to the Mexico City policy, the United States can't actually fund abortions through foreign aid. So we can't support any organization that even mentions abortion, basically. It's a very strict policy, so I don't think that would be really an issue. I don't think teams.
Oh, I forgot about that policy. Yeah,
I don't think teams need to worry too much about arguing that. But what could be argued just as a minor repair, if it's just too hard to beat this case on things like inherency. Obviously, there's the inherency issue of the Supreme Court ruling. I'll touch on that in just a second. If you can't beat it on inherency or harms, I would suggest going at it with a minor repair and saying, let's take all that funding that's going to these awful camps, or even the not awful, just regular hospital procedures for sterilization. Let's also let's redirect that, I should say, to preventative measures like birth control, condoms, things like that. There's a variety of methods of birth control, preventative things that have come out. I won't go into detail on this show, into all of that, but you can look that up in your own time and definitely use that as a potential minor repair counter plan. Now, I said I would touch on inherency, so I want to do that. One big thing with this case, I have not personally run against it, so I can't account for the dates, but I have heard it said that all of the issues cited are from 2016 or before that, all of them. Now, in 2016, the Supreme Court of India actually outlawed, or they didn't necessarily outlaw. I don't know how their judicial system works in India, if they have that sort of authority, but I would assume the wording for it would be they made a ruling that says these camps are prohibited, and as a result, they're trying to get rid of them, and they are moving away from these camps, but it takes time to enforce, and it takes until about 2019 or 2020, I think, to fully implement the court ruling. So we're just now able to see the impacts of it, and as a result, we can't say that this issue is an inherent issue that's not going away. Whenever it's still they're working to get rid of it actively right now. So those are things I would urge teams to look into. I think I'll leave it there, but there's a lot of ways you can come at this case. All in all, it's a very, very interesting case, so I don't want to downsize it, but there's a lot to research, and it's something teams need to be prepared against.
Yep. What's the next topic right here? I believe you're taking it.
Yes, talking about some interesting news from the White House, actually. So this is pretty basic. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it, but this is something that has come from the Trump administration, and that is recent aid cuts to Guatemala, Honduras, and I believe that is El Salvador. So I think this is referred to as sort of the Northern Triangle of Latin America. I might be incorrect on that phrase, but that's the gist of it. And the reason why I believe the president has touted cutting this aid to these countries is that they aren't doing enough to fight illegal immigration, drug trafficking, things like that going across our southern border. And so he wants to punish them or incentivize them to actually do better on that. Here are some of the problems with that, and here are some of the things that could come in handy as a result of these. So first of all, just from some debate case perspectives, this could open up a number of cases. So you could argue that we need to send aid back to all of these countries or a specific country or something along those lines. Additionally, this this policy move by the president basically fulfills one of the cases out there, the Honduras case. There's different versions of it, but there's a case to, in some form or another, suspend aid to Honduras. This case essentially fulfills that. In fact, it goes beyond that, but I'll leave that up to your own discretion if you want to look into cases with it. So it leaves some interesting room with that. Some arguments for that, just for this policy move really quickly, of course, would be that countries need to be incentivized to earn our aid. We should spend money in a way that benefits us. So we should take that money and spend it on building a wall or protecting our southern border, or at least incentivizing these countries to actually do a better job of protecting the border and stopping people from getting across illegally. Now, some arguments against this might be, and I've actually seen some things in the literature about this already, talking about how aid recipients, so these countries like Honduras, El Salvador, and so forth, actually spend multiple times more money than we give them in aid fighting drug trafficking and illegal immigration. So they're actually trying to do these things. It's just that they are poor countries, supposedly. I'm not trying to take a side on this. I'm just saying things I've read so that, arguments can be understood. Supposedly they spend a lot more than we give them fighting these things. So it's not like, they're just dumping it all into welfare. They're getting rich off it. They're spending more than we give them, doing the things we want them to do.
Could I jump in?
What's that?
Could I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
A case idea would be just thought of this. You could argue because we are pulling away aid, more people will not have access to water and food. So then more people will try to immigrate over the southern border. So therefore, we should give them back their.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, that's actually one of the issues. I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't plan on touching on that aspect to it, the more civilian aspect to it, but that is a genuine concern that has been expressed by some people on this issue, that some of this aid, any aid that tries to make the situations better in these countries, if that doesn't work, or if we cut it off, or if these countries can't get up and off their own feet in the first place, then there's no way we can expect people to stop coming from these countries because they're so poor and just bad conditions overall. So that's definitely a great argument. One quick note on that. I was actually listening as I was heading out the door this morning to go to a class. I was actually listening to a news report, or my mom was listening to it, and she told me about it, of a father and son in a church in, I believe, Tijuana, Mexico right now, trying to get asylum in the United States, asylum from violence in Honduras. I believe, were Honduran citizens, and the son was basically targeted for not joining gangs. And that's a big issue, because whenever you have gang, warlord-ridden places in these very poor, very violent ends of Latin America, if you do not join, or if you don't comply, or if you don't do whatever, if you stand out in some way, suddenly you become a target. So a lot of the people coming across the border for asylum typically do so because they are trying to escape things like that aid could be intended to help with. So it could be police aid, military aid, things like that, intended to help these countries actually get rid of some of that violence. So if we don't do that, arguably we can make it worse. Now, there's arguments about how much of it's actually economic conditions versus violence that's causing people to seek asylum, because that affects whether or not people qualify, but I won't get into that right now. But that's an argument out there for that.
It is important to note, though, that under the UN regulations for refugee status, if you're a refugee, you have to stop in the next country that you walk in. So if you walk out of Honduras into Mexico, then you're going to be staying in Mexico if you're fleeing from Honduras.
That's interesting. I actually did not know that. definitely a really good point there. I appreciate that. Last 1 or 2 points on this. Again, this is I've already basically aid that's getting police aid, military aid, economic aid. Some of these things go to combat the issues that we're concerned about. So the things that, Honduras or Mexico or El Salvador, they're not doing enough to fight these issues. Well, some of the aid that we give them actually is intended to combat those issues. So in a way, it's arguably counterproductive and harsh that we're cutting it off. Another argument is just that that coordination with these countries, whether it's through aid or through some sort of agreement, whatever it may be, coordination and strategy with countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, since those are really key countries in the fight on against illegal immigration, we need to work with those countries to actually figure out where it's coming from, how it's flowing, how to stop it. Gangs, drugs, a lot of that's organized crime. So having task forces of police, military, whatever it may be, DEA, etc., to try to address that is arguably critical to actually effectively stop it, and therefore by potentially hurting relations with these countries a little bit, or cutting off actual programs that were intended to help with that, we could see some negative impacts to that. So all in all, not saying that's necessarily what will happen, but those are some of the arguments that are going to be out there. So that leaves a whole lot of room for new cases. And I hope that helps you all with it. In closing, whether it's on this issue or any of the other issues we've talked about in this episode, do you have anything you want to add or disagree with me on, Elijah? I'm just curious.
I don't think there's anything I disagree with, or just looking at what our plan was. I don't think. I'll repeat my public service announcement. So the challenge for you guys is to send us a word that we will have to use at our next tournament in one of our speeches. So if you send us the word supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, I will have to use that in a speech. I have no idea how, but I will have to use it. If we get more than like 3 or so, then we're each going to pick one out of the pile. You can send us your word of course, excluding cuss words and stuff that's not very nice.
Basic obscenity is prohibited.
Yeah, no obscenities. You can send us your word on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or email. For email, it's teampolicypodcast@gmail.com. I keep forgetting what the Instagram and Facebook is. What is
the Instagram and Facebook are just Team Policy Podcast. So whether you go to Instagram.com, Facebook.com, either one, just put /Team Policy Podcast, or just look up at Team Policy Podcast on either one, and you will find us.
Yeah, same thing for YouTube. We'll be using these words at our next debate tournament. That's all I have to say, Christian.
I think that wraps it up. I know this is super sort of spontaneous and not very organized, but I hope this provides you guys with some valuable content. And again, Steven's out this week, but we hope to have him back on soon once he gets back in town. And anyway, guys, we hope you have a great rest of your week or weekend whenever you're listening to this. And let us know if you encounter anything interesting at your next debate tournaments. Other than that, we will probably be putting out some content soon on prep for Night Talk for those of whom are going. So stay tuned for that. That should be really interesting, and we will talk to you all soon.